I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP, and first and foremost I would like to say thank you for viewing this video and visiting my channel. The topic of this video will be on embodiment theory part 2, which is connected to obviously a preceding video of on embodiment part 1. And the primary, or at least preliminary remarks I would like to make is what I'm trying to avoid is a reductionary genealogy, or a reductionist genealogy, essentially pulling and simplifying typology, pulling all that's meaningful out of typology and simplifying it to mere neurochemical mechanisms or rules of biology, and saying that people are ultimately determined or can be simplified into mere causal explanations, and I don't want to do that. And that's not why I'm recasting typology in this manner. However, I would say that because of theories of mind and cognitive philosophies, there have been just rather pernicious tenets that have arisen in typology, or just the way that people even conceive and think of the psyche, insofar as you have dualistic elements embedded within it. You have all of these elements that are just not true. And I bring up embodiment theory to simply say that you can't have a mind without a body. It's been shown through cognitive science, through neuroscience, through what we understand now, given the psychological systems and neuro developments, that just what is existent and what's extant within the psyche is only there because of the bodies we have. And it's what leads me to say that being what you are determines who you are. Just the actual apparatus that exists in our mind, the brain, the psyche is nested within the brain. The brain is nested within the body. These things are all housed and extant through a body, and I hope to create some sort of corporeal anchoring, not a corporeal centricism, in saying that the body is the explanatory agent for all phenomenon, but to say that you take the sort of psychic world per se, and you merge it with the physical world, and you have a more equimonious view of typology. And it is then to say that the analytic school is one that sprung from neuroscience. Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, which Jung was depth psychologist. He was from the analytical school of thought, and he founded all of his ideas in typology upon analytical thought. And analytical thought has a biological underpinning. It has a Darwinian framework for which it sort of constructs itself, and through concatenation, through just linking ideas together, emerges, and it starts with the biological analytical train or frame of reference. And I think that this is necessary, and also too why I bring embodiment theory into typology, saying that it is a necessary basis for understanding personality and temperament. I think that as one who studied psychoanalysis, that the primary and fundamental question to all things that stem from depth psychology or psychoanalysis is what it means to be human. And that has to be the number one concern, or just factor and agent at which we address or reference all thoughts, all pieces of data, all pieces of evidence to we interpret and we use that information through this lens, if we're truly going to call it typology, it has to be under a specific sort of governing structure of thought, because there are things that emerge now and things that people say which are not justified insofar as if they're not falsified by Jung's thought or Briggs' thought, or the sort of the grounding theoretical work that exists in typology. They're contradicted by physical facts, or just empirical or scientific fact. I guess because I'm an INTP, I care about harmonizing and harmonizing the information and ridding the system of these contradictions. Therefore, embodiment theory is necessary, because it puts sort of limitations on what one can even begin to think about when it comes to perception and conception, being able to conceive things and take in the world. You take in the world because of in the manner you do, because of what you are. Your perception, human perception, is not an objective phenomenon. I don't know if anybody has quite realized this insofar as what it means specifically to just the overall picture of the psychic constitution of an individual, but it's to say this, that you can't have, because nature is conservative, and to be a human being is a specific phenomenon or organism or species, you can't have anything that exists outside of a sort of current perceptual framework. It's not even current perceptual framework, but insofar as an arcane or archaic perceptual framework, meaning that nature over time has selected for the elements and structures of the brain that are extant, and all personality and temperament is housed within this. And that typology, though it is a question of the psyche and psychic constitution, it is fundamentally a question of neurology and the structures of the brain. And if it is the question of neurology and the structures of the brain, then it is a question that ultimately comes down to genealogy, or just for any biological element, there is a cellular element, and there's a question of just an evolutionary process, and there is a question of how the body acts, how genes work and act to represent things and their emergent structures as it does. That is just to say that before anyone makes a claim, or before anyone comes to a conclusion, they have to consult the right referential framework, and even saying, is this something that's possible? Is this something that's true, given the fact that people are what they are? It's not to sort of burden the rest of the community with the rest of the community that may not have a non-analytical and non-medical and non-biological or physiological background, with a new language and system of symbols that may be quite painful to aggregate. But it's just to say that maybe ask the bigger questions, and whether or not what you're saying about an individual necessarily makes sense, given just basic tenets of just human nature and what human beings are, and sort of taking that landscape or that focus and using that as a backdrop for the discussion of typology in general, the discussion of personality in general. And it's so, from moving from this preface, or just really my motivations and what I'm truly trying to accomplish in this statement here, or this new structure, and saying that perception is something that is, and which I've mentioned previously, perception is one that is tightly or integrally connected to what a thing is. You cannot get that sort of perceptual framework outside of that biological existence. that biological existence, however it is that the neurochemicals in their brain, however their neurophrenology is arranged, that is what's extant or what's being conveyed in the individual through their actions and through their interaction with the environment. I think we know this sort of tacitly or implicitly through, if anyone knows anybody who suffers with a personality disorder such as depression or schizophrenia. Largely, there are, of course, other external factors that lead to depression and schizophrenia insofar that don't have any relation to their genetics or the biological and neurophonology of the individual, or at least can't be perceived to have a direct correlation with those things, but a great deal of the picture of why they actually live the way that they do, why they actually perceive the world the way that they do, why they interact and do the things they do, harmonize or disassociate or disharmonize with the environment, comes down to so much of the neurochemical working, the neurophrenology of that individual. You cannot have what exists externally. You cannot make the impressions and the psychic content. You cannot have any of these things. They're not manifest without the actual mapping and structuring of the brain. And it's for anything that you see in a way that people are adapting, learning, dealing with, acting, perceiving, telling, any of these actions elicited can be shown and directly drawn back to the mapping of the brain and the neurophrenology of the individual. It is to say this, that temperament rests in the brain, and that one's perception is something of cognition in of itself. Not perception insofar as the individual, but the overall gross, general human perception, as in we have our own sort of necessary cognitive biases that exist because we're people. Then we have cognitive biases that exist on top of the people cognitive biases given our personality. Those things act in sort of a reactive manner with one another and produce the phenomena which the world sees or which we conceive as self, as just who we are or what we are. It's to say this, that because people are photon sensitive, we have the prefrontal cortex is structured in the way it is because we are able, just a lot of what we are insofar as how we've evolved determines just what we even care about or look for in the environment. And the point of embodiment theory is to say that there is a very real limitation and structure to human perception in general. Then one can take that and go to temperament itself and realize that there is a limitation and a specific structure to one's temperament. Do I think these things are directly synonymous with one another? To an extent, yes, but to what extent, it's not very clear. But I will say this, that what you are determines who you are, and that's what embodiment theory leads me to. And who you are is the perception you have of the world. You can only be in existence in this manner which you actually exist. That's a phenomenological argument, but it's to say that your experiences, they are what they are because of how your mind is structured, and they will be what they are, independent of sort of the factors that exist in reality, and independent of so many other things. It's just that the world, what we see, and how the brain chooses to represent perception is that nothing is as definite as it truly seems to us. That objects in the environment, even when one is a sensing type, it's their brain creating that perception of that object, and it exists there in the manner that it does because of the image of the brain itself. It's sort of why Descartes, he came to doubting everything, because how can you really know what exists in the world, because it all is a projection of one's perception. It's not to say that all things are relative, but it's to say that you can't know exactly what objective reality is, because the brain, it renders the general information into a pattern at which we can make out and act on, and it seems to even construct this pattern of what it makes for us to act on partly through memory, which is just very mind-blowing to me. And I don't know how that exactly works. I just know that that's what the research shows. And it's to say that the reality we know is somewhat of a neurological construction. And that neurological construction just comes down to the brain, and the brain comes down to the body. And so we have to understand just sort of how we're getting through the world, and how we even view typology and look at it through the brain and body dynamic. And that's really the point and the purpose of embodiment theory. And in the next, because this is embodiment theory part 2, but in part 3, what I hope is to show what I just coin or term as the evolution of personality, just why perception looks the way it does, what that means to temperament, and why you can't have 1,001 different personality types. Thank you, and hope to see you in the next video.